there was another body exchange. Had these happen every few weeks, and there have been a total, I think, 61 so far, starting in May of 2022. And the most recent exchange came out to something like, 41 Russian bodies and 909 Ukrainian bodies. And that's the largest ratio. That's approximately 22 to 1. It's a huge ratio, a huge difference right there. And it's part of a trend. It's not like this is some sort of aberration. If you look at the graph and, the previous exchanges, you'll see that starting a little better than a year ago, approximately around the time of Avdiivka, it's just that the number of Ukrainian bodies started to increase, and then it really to accelerate. So now it's a very steep curve if you graph it. It's just, I think previous to this, it was like 17 to 1 and then 16 to 1. It's been rising steadily from maybe 2 to 1 way back a year ago. So this is interesting. It obviously reflects some difference on a change on the battlefield. And what would that be? I mean, what does this tell us? I think you'd have to say it's about movement more than anything on the battlefield. If you have a completely static battlefront, there could be a lot of violence, a lot of people dying, but the other side's not going to be picking up the bodies. So, for example, if if the Russians are just pulverizing the Ukrainians in their trenches and bunkers and hitting convoys behind the lines, and to give an example too, is like these missile strikes. They can be deep in the interior. That's not going to show up. None of that's going to show up because it's all within Ukrainian controlled territory. So the Ukrainians, okay, they lose their men. Their men are killed, but they pick up the remains, and return them to their families, and that's how it goes. So that none of those casualties appear in the statistics, and it's just likewise for the Russians. So you could have a very violent conflict, but if the line is static, you're just going to see very few remains being picked up by the other side. So very little need for a body exchange. But so what does this show? It shows, I think, essentially that the Russians are successfully attacking, and the Ukrainians, their counterattacks, which we hear about quite frequently, are not successful, because it's in those situations where the Russians are going to be collecting Ukrainian remains. Just to give you an example, just to illustrate, if the Russians rush across the field and take a Ukrainian trench, the Ukrainians are, either all the soldiers there die and the Russians collect those remains, or maybe a few escape, but they don't have time to take their fallen comrades with them. So that's one instance. It's a successful Russian attack is going to be reflected in this exchange, in these body exchanges. But then also an unsuccessful, like, Ukrainian counterattack. If the Ukrainians attempt to rush across the field, and maybe they take a building or a trench, but the Russians retreat in good order, they know what they're doing, and then come back quickly and take them, well, they're going to again pick up a lot of Ukrainian remains. So I think that's what we're seeing. It's been a really striking increase. And interesting, that you see the increase even over the last few months when things really slowed down. You would think that, there's less movement on the front, in the months of, for example, December, January, and into February. But I think at least part of the reason we're seeing this acceleration, especially this huge 22 to 1 ratio, the last one, is that there is the Kursk debacle for the Ukrainians. That was a true collapse. And in that kind of situation, the Russians are going to be picking up a lot of Ukrainian bodies. And I think that's what happened. And I think it's reflected in that recent ratio. That's my guess.
Do we know if many of these bodies that they recovered are some of them non-Ukrainian, NATO or mercenaries from the UK or Poland, etc.?
Yeah, you hear reports on that. I think there's no question. Well, they're not going to be in these exchanges, so they're not going to be included. That's something that they're going to have to deal separately, with the respective countries, or maybe through Ukraine, but it's not part of the general exchange. So I don't think that's, I may be wrong, but that's not being mentioned in these reports, in the reports of the body exchanges.
Do you think those numbers are hidden? I mean, the governments obviously don't want to give the extent of their involvement if their men are dying in Ukraine or in Kursk.
Well, they no, they've been quite public about it. At least the Russians have been. It's something you'll see reports in RT, whatever. It's not something that they've tried to hide.
Right. I meant like on the Western side, though. They're hiding.
Yeah.
They don't want to.
Yeah, I think you know how it is. There is the narrative, and the narrative. The Ukrainians are always somehow just, even when they're retreating, the Russians are suffering many more casualties, and so on and so forth. So this doesn't help that narrative. Um,
Do we know how many casualties have been in the war total now? I mean, I hear different numbers
it's
constantly.
really hard to know. I just don't know. I think again the most reliable source for Russian casualties anyway is Mediazona, the Mediazona BBC project. And what they do, they have two methods, and one involves a fair amount of guesswork, and it doesn't. I've looked at it in the past. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't really reflect what's going on in the battlefield. But if you look over time, it seems like they changed the way that they represent the information. For whatever reason, when I looked at it more recently, it was harder to see. But in the past, you could see the graph. There was a very clear spikes in Russian casualties around certain events. During the first couple of weeks of the war, for example, when when the SMO was launched, that's not surprising. Another was during Bakhmut. And actually, interestingly, the body exchange shows the same thing. That there was no, it wasn't Bakhmut, but actually one place where there were more Russian remains being picked up than Ukrainian was during the 2023 offensive, because that's the one time when the Ukrainians were advancing. They didn't advance very much, but they did. They did take some trenches. They did take some. So you don't see anything like the 22-1, but you saw some like 2-1s and 3-1s for a couple months there. And again, it's a reflection of movement, a combination of movement and firepower. Let's put it that way. But anyway, going back to Mediazona, their statistics show a spike at the beginning, and then another one at Bakhmut. And then a smaller one actually at the beginning of Avdiivka. And then after that, it's just been steady or dropping ever since. And they have now a total of, I think, 101,000, that they say they were able to confirm. And it seems that they do have a rigorous methodology. It's not just guesswork, it's not, what they do is they actually go read obits and read local papers, because if somebody's let's say in a town was killed on the front, that's going to appear in the news. And they even go to cemeteries and so they try to be as thorough as they can. They can't be sure that they got on everybody, but I think they get pretty close. And so that 101,000 is, I think, a reliable figure. It's got to be close to the actual total. I mean, that's the best that we have. Now, with the Ukrainians, we just don't know. There's something similar on the Ukrainian side, but I have my doubts about how rigorous it is.
So they're really, I mean, I hear numbers like 1 million on the Ukrainian side. Will we know at some point?
We might, yeah. I wish actually the Russians would say, I think they should be honest about it. But for whatever reason, they made a choice not to reveal those numbers.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Why aren't the Russians reporting casualty numbers? We're completely in the dark. I think it's a very important thing in terms of being able to end this war. If we saw that the casualty numbers were 8-1 in favor of the Russians, that for every Russian that died, 8 Ukrainians were dying.
Right. Well, I mean, except we wouldn't know what the ratio is because the Ukrainians aren't revealing. Occasionally Zelensky will say something, but it's just that nobody believes it, including, I think, nobody in Ukraine believes it. Most definitely in Ukraine, nobody believes it. I think he said 37,000, then he went up to 41,000, and that's just not even close. It may be off by a magnitude of 10. I don't know. Again, we can just speculate. You can say that, like on the Russian side, Their disadvantage is that they are advancing in general, or they're attacking much more than the Ukrainians are. Now, there are big exceptions to that. There are these counterattacks that the Ukrainians continuously launch, and they fail. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the bodies. And then there was Kursk, where, again, they were just out in the open and attacking. But more often than not, they're hunkered down in their bunkers and in places like Donbass and in different fortifications. And so they have the advantage of being on the defense. But they also are at an extreme disadvantage when it comes to artillery. It's something that they have admitted to many times. Sometimes we hear a ratio of 10 to 1, 5 to 1, whatever. It's a huge difference. The Russians have just a total superiority in that category. And of course, artillery can cause a lot of casualties, even to people who are hunkered down. And then Russia has pretty much an absolute air superiority, and so they use these glide bombs at will, and these glide bombs can just take out bunkers and all kinds of fortifications. So in spite of having the advantage of being on the defensive, I think that advantage of the Ukrainians is more than nullified by the superior Russian firepower. So I would just guess, I assume, but it's a guess, that there are more deaths, considerably more deaths on the Ukrainian side. I think probably the most telling is just what you're seeing with the mobilization efforts. The Ukrainians are running out of people, and you see the average Ukrainian man is terrified at the idea of going to the front. Recently, there was an effort to try to get the 18 to 24s to volunteer. That's one group that they haven't been conscripting so far. So they actually, offer these very, very generous financial packages, and they had a media blitz, and it went on for roughly 3 months. And in that time, they got 500. That shows you there's very little willingness on the other side. And I think it's probably the awareness of the huge casualties. And, in contrast, on the Russian side, they're offering nice financial packages, kind of the equivalent of what they tried with the 1824s in Ukraine. They're quite generous, it's true. But a lot of people are signing up. Again, it's admitted that it's better than it was for a while, 30,000. It's been going up. It's something like 40,000 a month. And if casualties were that extreme, people would know, even if it's not being reported. People know. They know, like my cousins, they all went off and none of them came back, or only half of them came back, or something like that. They say, I'm not going. But that's obviously just not happening. So I think that's the most telling thing. I don't know what it is, but clearly the casualties are skewed in favor of the Russians.
Yeah, it's, these numbers, even on the Russian side, 101,000.
That's a lot.
It's a large number. Yeah. I mean, just thinking in World War II, the U.S. lost what, 500,000? Is that right?
Approximately, yes.
Approximately 500,000, and we are have more population in America. Russia is what, like 160?
Well, it was about the same.
Back then.
America back then is about like Russia now. Actually, Russian population really took a huge hit because of World War II. All those young men that were killed. That set back Russian demographics, by decades. And Russia would probably have a lot more people now if it wasn't for World War II. They have roughly 150 million now.
Mm. Yeah, it is a big number. And you think on the Ukrainian side, we know it's going to be higher than that. I hear people say 1,500,000. Maybe we'll find out. But regardless,
right.
For a country that size, it's devastating. I don't think this war is just kind of going on in the background. I don't think people can fully absorb the amount of loss, the sacrifice of all these bodies, all these men. It's a huge number.
Right.
We see what's happening in Gaza, and it's horrific because it's primarily civilians, and we're seeing it constantly. But we're talking about maybe when this is all said and done, maybe 1 million people, men that have died in this conflict in Ukraine. I mean, America, we haven't sacrificed the way that these countries have sacrificed in terms of human loss.
Right.
It's really horrifying.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a very bloody war. It's actually, again, 101,000 is a lot, but I think that like the Russian figure would be much higher if the Russians were more aggressive. You know, they get a lot of criticism, or Putin does, the Russian government does, for being so cautious and proceeding, you know, so methodically uh, on the front. But you know, again, you know, when you aggressive attacks are just result, and this has always been true, even you know prior to the invention of drones. It's always been true that those you know large scale big arrow attacks result in a lot of casualties among the attackers. I heard a figure just the other day that like when the Russians or the Soviets took Vienna towards the end of World War II, they lost 150,000 men in that campaign alone. And he said, you know, it's just like,
You don't even hear about that.
yeah,
No,
right. But that was just a footnote to, you know, because again, they lost a total of 27 million people, you know, quite a few civilians, but, you know, mostly soldiers. And yeah, so anyway, you know, I think that's one of the things that quite clearly that's been holding the Russians back. They're trying to be careful and preserve the lives of their men.
Have we ever seen something like what Ukraine is experiencing? You know, the inability to mobilize, having to do forced conscriptions like this because you have no manpower, and there seems to be no sign. It seems like Zelensky he's showing no signs of wanting to negotiate and end this war. But you don't have any men, and you're having to pull people off the street. You can't get people to volunteer. Have we had a war like that where this is how it kept on going? Is that you have to just, you know, force conscript people, pull people off the street?
I can't think of a historical parallel. There must be one somewhere, but you know, not in recent history. I don't think even under you know under the Nazis, they didn't have that kind of problem. They didn't have to grab people. I mean, I'm sure that we would have seen newsreels or reports of that if that had happened. Maybe it did, but I'm not aware of it. But it's just a constant feature of life in Ukraine now.
It's crazy. It makes this whole thing so sinister that you know that we can't end this war, and the Europeans seem to want to keep it going. Zelensky wants to keep it going when the people don't want to fight. And it just seems so wrong to say, okay, keep on going into the meat grinder, die. We'll run out of boys. You know, we'll try to lower the age more. And, you know, we'll try to pull in people from Europe or whatever so they can continually die. And it's like, for what? Like, what are they trying to? What are they selling people? Is it just this idea that if we don't do this now, they'll be walking, you know, right down the Champs Elysees before you know it?
Yeah, well, sometimes they make those claims, not always. In general, the idea is, well, we can't reward the aggressor. You know, like the Russians can't be rewarded for their aggressive behavior. You know, that would be appeasement. It would send the wrong signal to the Russians in the future, but also to the Chinese. The Chinese will see this and they'll take Taiwan. That's the kind of argument that they make. You know, let's say even if you believe that. You have to stop and think, you know, it's just like we've been hearing that argument for, you know, well over 2 years, nearly the whole 3 years of probably the whole, you know, the entirety of the SMO, right? And most definitely ever since the fall of 2022, the situation has gotten progressively worse for the Ukrainians. And so it's just like what you're saying is, okay, it's been getting worse and worse, and actually the deterioration on the Ukrainian lines has been, you know, in spite of the Rasputitsa and the slowdown and a couple months ago, still you could see overall it's been accelerating. It's just, you know, it's getting worse at a faster rate. But they say that still we can't let them, you know, we can't let the Russians profit from this. We can't let maybe you believe this, maybe you truly believe this, but you still have to be realistic. It's just like with every passing month, with every passing year, it gets worse for Ukraine, and the Russians are stronger and they have more. So if you really want, okay, you don't have a choice between, let's say, depriving the Russians of all, the gains of the war and, the current situation. You have a choice between the current situation and a future in which the Russians have even more. That's the realistic thing. So it's just like they're still trying to tell themselves and other people that we can turn this around. And now, how long are we going to believe this? Again, it's for a lot better than 2 years. They've been saying that, and things have just been getting worse and worse and worse. Where is it? What's the plan you have? What's the wonder weapon? You've thrown all the wonder weapons in there. You've had your great counteroffensive, and you had the Kursk incursion, and all of them ended in utter failure. You had the Krinky bridgehead, which was one of the greatest disasters of all. Every attempt at actually trying to take back some of that territory has just been utterly disastrous. So where is your plan? They don't. They just sort of like, well, we'll just hope for some sort of black swan event, some kind of miracle. That's not a plan. That's not what responsible statesmen do. You just look at the reality and you say, actually, the best thing for Ukraine is if we just take Putin's offer right now. Okay, they would lose those 4 oblasts in Crimea, but we're not going to get them back. And at least they would still have, access to the Black Sea. They would still have Odessa and Nikolaev and Dnipro and Kharkov. There's still a big chunk of it they would keep. They would be a viable country, and they would still have control of in most, at least in the northern part, both sides of the Dnieper. But if we don't, the Russians are going to keep on marching. They'll start to demand more, and then the situation always gets worse and worse and worse. So it's just this refusal to recognize reality, this kind of emphasis on moral purity, and again, I certainly believe it's a false moral purity. I mean, the truth is that again, like the origins of the war are not just Russian aggression and inquisitiveness. There's obviously much more to that. And in fact, the Russians kept on trying to allow the Ukrainians to hang on to territory, and the Ukrainians didn't let. So, even the moral purity argument just doesn't work. They are fundamentally deluded, and this delusion is leading to the destruction of Ukraine.